Welcome to London, one and all. My name is Father Jim Leese, and I am the academic lead for Notre Dame's Global Gateway in London. And I want to thank you for your active participation, for those of you who've been engaged in this ongoing global dialogue discussing the worsening water crisis. Some of you know that in the past sessions, we traveled to Nairobi and Malawi, to the west coast of Ireland, and the city of Mumbai, and to Mexico City to discuss topics surrounding water. It is our endeavor to continue these important conversations discussing the global water crisis by building a virtual community and connecting with all of you as a global audience to reflect on the material presented throughout this series. We hope that your experience with this series continues to be insightful and engaging, and that you are connecting not only to us here at ThinkND, but also to the global community engaged in this series. The continued support that we receive from our sponsors is essential to our good work, and so I want to acknowledge the Global Dialogue Series gratitude toward the Notre Dame, the Office of Notre Dame International, the Office of the President at Notre Dame, the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and the various colleges and units on campus that have been helpful in strengthening the university's commitment to being a leader in discussion about the pressing global needs of humanity. This week, we're excited to have the opportunity to discuss the sustainability of rivers in London, as well as research methods and thinking in landscape archaeology within the city. London is one of the great international capitals of the world, and a river runs through it, to steal the title of one of my favorite films of the 90s. That river, as you know, is the iconic waterway, the River Thames. As well as featuring in many literary works over the centuries, London's tidal river offers us clues about the past. Early in the morning, you can spot individuals doing something called mudlarking, the practice of scavenging through river mud for lost items of value or historical significance. I have not yet been caught mudlarking, but I look forward to one day doing it. The term mudlarking was originally used in the late 18th and 19th centuries to describe people often living in poverty or with limited employment, who scoured London's riverbanks at low tide to find whatever treasures they might find. Nowadays, though, the activity is more of a hobby than an occupation, with participants often looking out for pieces with interesting histories rather than simply monetary value. This week, we're delighted to have London faculty member and UCL archaeologist Faye Stevens, as well as Gustav Milne, the project leader for CITiZAN, of which you'll say a bit more. They'll speak to us about the development of phenomenological research methods and thinking in landscape archaeology within the City of London, and the excavation of waterfront sites along the Thames. We also ask that you become a part of this conversation today, and if you have any questions for our speakers, we'd ask that you use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. We will try and answer as many of them as we can at the end of the program, but we would ask you to submit them as soon as you have them and just offer them into that chat function, and they'll be put into a queue of questions that we'll look at after the formal program. As you may know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos that were posted on ThinkND, where Professor Faye Stevens discussed a few themes. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch them, I recommend going to ThinkND, and you'll be able to watch them even after this program's over. As we begin, I want to offer an introduction for Faye and for Gustav, and then we'll move into our program. Faye is an archaeologist and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame. She specializes in the philosophy of phenomenology and archaeology, and was part of a groundbreaking project at UCL, University College London, developing phenomenological research methods and thinking in landscape archaeology. This includes research into the ritual deposition of material culture into watery locales, and the development of new courses around sustainability and water, including rivers and tides, a biography of the River Thames, London, for the University of Notre Dame, London faculty. And environmental conservation and sustainable thinking, natural places as heritage for the University of Notre Dame pre-college program. Our other presenter today, Gustav Milne, is a project leader for CITiZAN, which is an acronym for Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network, and is responsible for overseeing the nationwide project from Museum of London Archaeology London office. He heads up CITiZAN's 3 dedicated teams, London, New York, and Portsmouth, and is responsible for developing the project. He began working in archaeology in the City of London in the 1970s, gaining expertise in the excavation of waterfront sites along the Thames. He has worked on a wide range of sites from Roman, Saxon to medieval, including the site of the Roman London Bridge. Gus founded the Thames Archaeological Survey in 1993 and the Thames Discovery Program in 2008. And now I'd like to welcome my colleagues, Faye and Gustav, to talk to us about our topic for today, Rivers and Tides, a biography of the River Thames and the sustainability of the rivers in London. Faye and Gustav, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Father Jim. Absolutely delighted to be here, and looking forward to what lies ahead over the next hour. Gus and I have had some great conversations around the session today. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in setting up this wonderful programme and the fantastic resources and materials that are being generated as part of that. It really is a community of sharing and a community that's very engaged and passionate about this very important topic. For today, the way Gus and I thought would work very well for all of you would be that Gus will give a short presentation to us all about his work and about some fascinating archaeology around and in and on the Thames. I will then give a short presentation on the new course that I'm teaching for the London faculty, the Rivers and Tides course. And then Gus and I will have a conversation about 2-3 key themes that we feel are very relevant to the topic of this particular event, which will then lead it open up for conversation and questions, not necessarily answers, but definitely questions and and conversation, let's say that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Gus. Gus, you just need to unmute yourself there, and I will screen share your presentation.
Can you all hear me?
Absolutely.
Yep. If you can't, then I'm very sorry. But I'll try and shout. What I'd like to talk to you about today is how archaeology, i.e. the study of the physical remains of the past, can actually tell us a huge amount about how the River Thames, this river in London, has changed quite dramatically, partially by human hand and partially by that wonderful thing, climate change. We have to remember that climates are always changing and the world is never standing still. And it's that interaction between natural forces and human doggedness that leads us to the changing river in London. So we'll be looking at those things, and I'll be trying to get the slide to go to the next slide. Oh, excellent. Now, what we're going to be talking about is the River Thames, the river that runs through London. And this aerial photograph you can see here shows an aerial view of the blue, sinuous River Thames snaking through the apparently green London. It's not really that green, but that's what this aerial photograph pretends that it is. Nor is a river that blue. That's also what this aerial photograph pretends the river is. But that's a view from Richmond, right the way, which is in the far west of London, right the way down to the east of London, which is about 25 miles or so. Now, what you can see there is the one of our areas of study for the Thames Discovery Programme, which is one of the programmes that we run, which is a programme where we invite members of the public, our citizen scientists, to come down to the foreshore at low tide to monitor sites, archaeological sites where are exposed to erosion on the foreshore, and record what we see one day. When we go down the next day, it might not be there again. So it's a constant monitoring of sites on the foreshore. And we relate this to sites that have been excavated by professional archaeologists from the Museum of London on the adjacent dryland sites, perhaps 20 years before or about maybe 20 years in the future, because the information obviously relates from the foreshore to the terrestrial site. And what we know is the river you see here isn't a real river at all. It's really just a tidal canal. And I'm finding difficulty moving my slides on. Next slide, please, as they said in the old days. Ah, thank you. So if you look at this slide, you can see the brown bits, which are the high ground of London, with that same blue river snaking through it. But I hope you can see the white space between the blue river and the brown hills. This is again, we're looking at a 25-mile span. Now, yes, that white space there is what we call the floodplain. And if you think about what is a floodplain, that means the blue bit should extend from there to there. It should extend all over the floodplain in times of high tide. So you can see the river was once extremely wide, but is now very, very much narrower. That's because it's constrained between artificial concrete, brick or steel river walls. So we have converted a natural wide tidal river into a tidal canal. It's now constrained. But of course, rivers being rivers, they don't like being constrained. And every now and again, they think, I think I'll go back to my floodplain. And they burst their banks and flood all these areas here. So building river walls is helpful one day, but of course, the river can always breach them if it feels so inclined. Next slide, please. Right. So what we do as archaeologists is we can look at ancient sites, either on the foreshore, as you see here at Whitstable in Kent, which is in the outer estuary, where there's a very wide foreshore. At low tide, the river really drifts away, 100, 200 meters or so. And what we're looking at here, Lara and Mike, we're looking at the remains of a forest. You can see those ancient trees lying on the mud. So all this is inundated at high tide. There is the River Thames in the background. So this is the foreshore. And there was a forest growing here, but it's now inundated at high tide. That is to say, this was once dry land above the high water mark, and these were trees growing on the dry land above the high water mark. Now, what we can do as archaeologists is we can level this area, which was once dry land, above the high water mark, and we can date these trees with dendrochronological assessments or radiocarbon dating, and therefore tell you what the high tide used to be at the date of those trees. I'm still finding difficulty moving on slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. And here you see.
I'll move them for you, Gus. I know.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Faye, without which nothing would be possible. Now, what we have here is a cross section of one of those trees, which we've been able to date. And we've been able to date these to the Bronze Age, which is, 3,000 years ago or thereabouts. So these are ancient trees. And we've been able to look at, you'll see those white pins that we put in here, and we've dated, so we can actually date the calendar years, i.e. when the tree was born, when it started to grow, and when it stopped growing. It started to grow here, and we can count the rings, and we find that by the end of this period here, the very last ring is 1,874 years BC. And that's when the tree collapsed. That's when it became when that area was inundated. So we know the river was rising during the life of this tree and inundated this part of the Thames Estuary in 1874 BC. So we can actually date a major flood, which actually is not a major flood, it's a major inundation. The River Thames was rising, sea levels were rising, and inundated the land at that period. And what is very interesting, looking at these here tree rings, can you see, maybe you can't, but can you see how narrow these tree rings are, the last few tree rings are? They're very, very closely spaced because the ground, the high ground, was getting saturated with salt water as the river levels were rising and rising. And finally, the tree gave up growing when it was finally inundated. And we can find that within a generation, this area was once high ground, and within a generation, it was underwater. So river levels change, climate change can happen very quickly within the lifetime of the guys who were once wandering around in that forest. Next slide, please, Faye. Thank you. So that's two things that we found. We can actually date what the river level used to be right back in the Bronze Age, 3,000 years ago, and right up to the present day. And we can also say how fast that change was happening within 25, 30 years. You went from dry land to inundation. We can do this for the Roman period as well. And here in the City of London, the City of London has the Tower of London over here. You may remember that. St. Paul's Cathedral up there and London Bridge down here. Now, running between the Tower of London and almost St. Paul's, this street here is a line of a street called Upper and Lower Thames Street. And believe it or not, ancient Roman harbour sites are not underneath the modern day river wall here, but they're right back here, near Upper and Lower Thames Street. So in other words, there's been a huge amount of reclamation or encroachment on the river in the City of London over the past 2,000 years. And this little slide you see over here shows archaeologists working on a Roman harbour site, which was just next to London Bridge there. Next slide, please. And you can see how well preserved. Please, Faye, thank you very much. Go for it. Oh, thank you, brilliant. You can see the extraordinary, back one, please. Thank you. You can see the extraordinary preservation of the sites. Now, this is actually a slice through the Roman harbour in about 90 AD. That's a metre scale resting up against the wall of a warehouse. This is an open fronted warehouse. That's a timber floor, which leads out onto the working surface of the quay, which leads out to the quay front itself, the waterfront itself. And this is where the River Thames would have been, the height of the River Thames would have been in about 900 AD. Now, this is a tidal drain. So it disgorges into the Thames at low tide. So we know what the low tide level was. We know this working surface should be above the highest astronomical tide in the Roman period in AD 90, and they weren't expecting the floor of the warehouse to flood. So if we take levels, absolute levels there and there, we can date what the high tide would have been. If we look at this tidal drain, we can see how low the high tide was expected to be. And if we date these timbers, these massive oak timbers, by dendrochronological analysis or by radiocarbon dating, we can date this to 92 AD. So we know precisely what the level of the River Thames, the highest tide, was in 90 AD, and it's different from what it was in the Bronze Age, and it's different 3 meters lower than what it is today. So we can plot how the River Thames is changing its level over time. Next slide, please. And also how much we've changed the shape of the river. Now, this little pink plan over here shows you the sort of map you would get if you were wandering around London. This is the City of London on the north bank. This is the River Thames, and this is Southwark on the south bank. Now, as you walk around it, look at that canal, which is the River Thames today. And then these other two slides show you what the River Thames used to be like in the Roman period. Now, the River Thames was tidal, that is to say, high tide, we would have the river in full flood. At low tide, the river level would drop and would expose mud flats and islands on the south bank. So at high tide, this is what the River Thames looked like. There was an island on the south bank, and that island would have been here. And there would have been, so you can see how wide the river is there. It's 1 kilometre wide, but it's only about 200, 300 metres wide at that island there. So can you see how different the River Thames was at high tide in the Roman period to what it is today? It just looks different. It is different. It functions differently hydrodynamically. So we humans have managed to change the river. We've stopped it being a natural river with a natural tidal range, with natural islands and things on the south bank, converted it into this much built up tidal canal. So you can see why the river keeps wanting to flood, because it has a genetic memory of what it used to be able to do, and it likes to flood its floodplain. That's what rivers do. So we are constraining it, but not forever. River Thames, the river levels are rising, so we're going to get flooding one day. Next slide, please, Faye. And we've looked not just at the Roman high and low tide, but we've also looked further into the medieval period. After the Roman period, the Saxons arrived in 600 AD, and the medieval period, all those medieval kings in 1066, 1100, 1200, and all those Tudors in 1500s and 1600s. And we plotted different harbour structures over the course of time. In this slide over here, you can see the building up there, which I will give you a huge prize if you can guess what that is. And here you see in front of, that's St Paul's Cathedral, by the way, you can see a little lane leading down to the River Thames. This is about 1520, with a stone wall on that side and a stone wall on that side. And this lane leads down to the River Thames as it was in the 16th century. Now, on this slide here, you can see the line of a waterfront, a timber-built structure, timber-built wharf in 1290. The waterfront was extended forward in 1320s, 1330s, and it was extended yet further into the Thames in 1380, that structure there, and then further into the Thames in 1420, that structure there, which actually is another bit of that structure there. You can see how well preserved those structures are. When we do our photographs of archaeological sites, we always pick our shortest archaeologists to be the human scale, to make the sites look even more impressive than they actually are. And that's Puri and Harrison, who had literally the short straw. Stand there and look as though you're working. And here we see the medieval waterfront structure built on the medieval foreshore. So these were built at low tide, about that level there, and the working surface was built at high tide level, which is that level there. So once again, we can date these exactly, in this instance to 1194. We can tell you exactly what the river level was, high tide and low tide, in the 12th century. And we can compare that with the Roman period, and we can compare that with the Bronze Age. And if we do all these relatively simple comparisons, next slide, please, Faye, you know you can do it. Press that button. Thank you. Here we have a little graph, like a bit of science. And what this graph shows, down the bottom here, you've got 700 AD, 900 AD, 1100 AD, 1066 is about here, 12, 1300, 1500, 1700, 1900, and hallelujah, present day. And we plotted on here the highest tide, the highest anticipated tides, which we have established archaeologically by looking at lots of sites. If you remember, the Roman period is down here. During the medieval period, there was a gradual rise in the level of the River Thames, and therefore presumably sea level globally. And then can you notice that instead of going up on this nice gradual line, things have got awfully bad because they've suddenly started to shoot up. And once they got here at 1750, they started to shoot up even more. And if we look at this trend line and extend it upwards, this is where we are today. And this is where we will be in, 50 years time, 100 years time, 200 years time. We've been able to prove by looking at bits of old wood on London sites what the IGCP, the International Geological Correlation Program, spent millions of pounds trying to demonstrate that sea levels are rising very dramatically and they're not slowing down anytime soon. So the Thames levels are rising. Not only are they rising, but next slide, please. As the more volume in the water, and this can be seen, by the way, this is a little place called Tower of London. And this is a 15th century illustration which shows a river wall here. Can you see that little river wall, which still survives to this day? And here it is to this day. And the Thames Discovery Programme have been recording that river wall from the foreshore. And you can see these lower levels are the 15th century river wall. And these are the 16th and 17th century ones. And these are the 18th, 19th and 20th century ones. Can you see how high the river wall is now compared to how it used to be in the good old days of Geoffrey Chaucer, when he was the civil servant responsible for extending that waterfront, that quay wall? So the evidence is there for all to see. River levels are rising, and we have to keep raising our river walls to keep pace with the Thames that's trying to get over the top of it. Now, not only does that happen, next slide, please, Faye. I'm making her work today. Come on, Faye, wake up. Thank you.
There's a lag. Sorry, Gus. There's a lag on when I press it.
I don't want your excuses.
Yeah.
Just wake up. Now, not only are the river levels rising, but there's more water in the river, and therefore the tidal scour is more aggressive. So the foreshore is dropping as the river levels rise, because the foreshore is being eroded away, which is jolly good for archaeologists working on the foreshore, because we find lots of sites. And here we see an example of some sites at Greenwich, which is one of the World Heritage sites down on the Thames. There you see a wooden structure, which is of 16th century date, which is being eroded by the river here and has now gone. It's just disappeared. The foreshore is so active. And the trouble with an active foreshore, this is your chance to catch up, Faye. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, this is it. Oh, thank you very much. Brilliant. The foreshore erosion is so aggressive that the Thames Discovery Programme realised that the main wall, which is supporting the historic royal palaces at Greenwich, was being undermined by said River Thames. So it was suggested that they put this rock armour. Can you see all these bags of rocks, which have been at huge expense, placed right the way along the bottom of the river wall to stop it eroding, collapsing, and therefore all the palaces of the royal palace at Greenwich disappearing into the Thames. So the Thames is fighting back. If it doesn't go over the top and flood in Greenwich, it'll go underneath and take the river wall down. So we do have an interesting ongoing, I won't say battle, let's just say an engagement, a discussion with the River Thames, discussing where it wants to be and where we would prefer it to be. All these piles here, by the way, are a 16th century structure, which when we looked at this site in 1996, we couldn't see them. The foreshore was above that level. Since then, the foreshore's dropped so much that those piles are now visible and being washed away gradually. So this foreshore erosion is very aggressive because the river is aggressive, because the river levels are rising, and the more water there is in the Thames, the more aggressive it is. I don't mean that in a rude way, I just mean more vigorous, I should say. That's all I'll have to say. Faye, thank you very much for your time-delayed slide presentation, and I pass it back to you. Thank you, Faye.
Thank you so much, Gus. That was fantastic. Yeah, very, very rich archaeological record there for us to consider, and succinctly summarised by Gus there as well. Wonderful evidence on the foreshore to show the challenges that we face living so close to the river itself. For those of you who are interested in following up that further, on the resources link on the website, the Global Dialogues website for this particular programme, is an article by Gus written in 2015 called The Changing River. And also a collaborative paper that he wrote with his colleagues Natalie Cohen and Elliot Ragg and others from 2017 called Intertidal Archaeology, Sustainable Community Archaeology as well. So there's some extra material for you to follow that up, written by Gus and his colleagues as well. Thanks so much, Gus. I'll lead on to some nice follow-on for me to talk about the coarse rivers and tides, and then us to open up the conversation and answer any questions that we might have there as well. So I'm just going to come out of that. So I want to talk to you just and give you an outline of the course, which will be a lovely follow-on from Gus's material, because we'll be looking in the course at some of the points that he's raised, some of the sites that he's raised, and how that links to the minor in sustainability studies that's run at the university, and overall our interest in sustainability in the university this year. It's a key guiding theme for the university this year. This is a picture I took of the Thames from the Millennium Bridge last week, fizzing with all kinds of information from a sustainable perspective, which we can perhaps discuss later as well. So these wonderful global rivers that flow through the arteries of our landscape and create these beautiful, diverse cultural landscapes that we call rivers in our urban spaces. The hydrology and the liquid waters that flow through them that offer us an insight into sustainability from these, let's say, fluid standpoints, and how the environment of the rivers are central to the flourishing of both our human and our water worlds and other worlds as well. So in this course, we take the River Thames as a case study and do a lot of work around River Thames, but with a wider consideration of sustainability in relationship to global rivers. We chart the biography of the river from its earliest beginnings to the present day, draw upon a range of sources from ancient fish traps and trackways, ships and boats, foreshore archaeology, literature, material culture, museum collections, maps and environmental water worlds that ebb and flow with these ever-changing tides of the river itself. We start off by looking at three key lenses of sustainability there. As a starting point, we develop this further. This is a model through which the students each sign up to related to the river, in which they have to align with one or two of these lenses of sustainability. So our key performance indicators, they're the first lens that we look at, how we measure value and evaluate any kind of success or target making. So that's a model that's more widely applied to just sustainability, but an interesting one to start off with there as well, and used very effectively in sustainability studies. Our second lens of sustainability are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations Development of Economic and Social Affairs, their 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adapted in 2015. This shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and for the future. These 17 Sustainable Development Goals are an urgent call for action and very much about global partnerships. We then look at sustainability. Our third lens is the planetary boundary lens, and here is an image from the Stockholm Resilience group and site. This is the one that is cited in Stefan et al. Article of 2015. These planetary boundaries model is a very interesting one, three-dimensional model, a set of planetary boundaries within which humanity can continue to develop and thrive for generations to come. So in the class, we look at these, start off with looking at these three lenses of sustainability in some depth and consider them in some depth. And then the students each give a presentation and apply those sustainable development goals, for example, or planetary boundaries to them relating to the Thames. So we start off, of course, with the Thames Barrier, opened in 1854, spanned across the river at the Woolwich Reach, composed of 10 gates, helping to regulate the flow of water in the Thames, which is this tidal river, as has been mentioned by Gus itself. So 1984 is a little while ago now, so there is a need for some attention to be paid with regard to that. And we start off in the course by considering how you would develop this as a sustainable key performance indicator, sustainable development goals, and within the realm of the planetary boundaries. Some of the class presentations have included this fantastic paleoscape at Earth, where we can see in the slide underneath a whole ancient forest spanning from the Neolithic 3000 BC into the Bronze Age 2000 to 800 BC there as well. We've got root balls and nuts and plants and shrubs of over 15 species there, giving us a huge amount of information on the diversity of the environment back into prehistory and then as you see it today in this slide at the bottom there. Another presentation was on the Thames Estuary plan boundary there, aiming to manage the risk of flooding to people, property and the environment, to adapt how we can adapt to changes in climate, ensure sustainable and resilient development in the floodplain, protect the social and cultural commercial value of the tidal Thames, its tributaries and the floodplain, and to enhance and restore the ecosystems and maximise the benefits of the natural flood there. 2010 plan aiming to manage the threat of flood risk. Another presentation was on the Thames Tideway project, a big project happening in London at the moment, upgrading London's sewer system. So you can see the blue flow of the river here, and then this grey is the tunnel itself, a 25-kilometre tunnel currently under construction to intercept, store and ultimately transfer sewage waste away from the River Thames. The sewer system in London at the moment is very much a Victorian construct designed to serve 4 million people. We now have nearly 9 million people in the city. That fluctuates if it's a bit of commuting and working, with the population estimated to increase by 16 million in 2010. So it's a well-needed project, aims to be completed in 2025. The river, and this very much links to my research, is also a sacred place. And in the video, pre-recorded video that will be uploaded onto the website for you, I talk more about the sacred nature of water and sacred rivers and certain practices and social practices related to that. What's wonderful for us today is that the river is a sacred place for contemporary Londoners. And we can see that in a variety of ways. And this is one of those manifestations of that, a metal statue of Vishnu from the 20th century and 3 small Diwali lamps there, these little ceramic lamps showing us this. In the Hindu faith, the Thames is very much a sacred river in the contemporary life of Londoners who relate to and engage with the river in this very sacred way. We also go to on a field trip on the Thames Foreshore to Putney Bridge and look at a whole range of different archaeological evidences. On the left here, from this peat dating right back to the Mesolithic period, to evidence for historic and ancient fish traps. There's a little evidence of that there with the Thames Discovery Programme, and then linking to Gus's image earlier, evidence for strategies for building up on the side of the embankment there to manage any particular types of flood events. I hope that's given you a little feel and flavour for the course and some of the things that we do are doing, let's say, on the course there itself. Super. Let's have a look at the time. Great. So Gus and I were thinking that there were 3 lovely lap over points. Gus, if we could have you back on the screen, that would be great. With regards to Gus and I had a conversation around fish traps. We had a conversation around the tidal head and the fact that the Thames has different types of water at particular tidal events, from fresh to brackish to salt, and particular types of social actions relating to that. And we also, in a link to the notion of the sacred river, had quite an interesting conversation, very interesting conversation, Gus, around the moon and the presence of the moon. So that links beautifully to this sensorial, phenomenological engagement with the river itself. Just looking at the time, Father Jim, and wondering whether, how are you doing for questions? If you have a number of questions in, whether we go straight to the questions and weave those particular ideas in, or whether we've got time for Gus and I to just chat about a couple of those themes before any questions.
You know, I think you might do well to take up those themes to start. Yeah, and then I just encourage our participants to submit any questions that they may have. We do have some, and we'll be ready to go when you have had a chance to speak about it. But why don't you take 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Thanks. So, Gus, I wondered whether you wanted to say something about the tide and these particular water types that we see associated with the tide.
Yes, well, as the sea levels change, so the tidal head changes. The tidal head is the area at which, the point at which the salt water comes in at an incoming tide and then turns around and goes out again at an outgoing tide. The fresh water goes out and the salt water comes in. So if you're living in the City of London, which is at a tidal reach, in the old days, when you wanted to go down to the river to collect drinking water, you'd have to make sure you were collecting it at an ebb tide, but when the fresh water was there. And also, if you're watering your horses, it's best to do that when the river isn't salty. So different times of the day are very, very important for Londoners or Thames people living in the Thames Valley. They will know when it's good to drink the water and when it's only good for doing the laundry. And it's also vital for those who are travelling up and down the Thames. Today we're used to getting on buses and trains which don't take any notice of the Thames tide table. But if you were travelling by river, which so many people did in the past, they would have to know when the tide was turning, because no one was going to jump onto a ferry and go to Greenwich if the tide was going in the wrong direction. You'd have to sit and wait for the tide to turn. So, and also if you're in a ship and you wanted to take your cargo out to the North Sea, there was no point in going there when the tide was coming in. You would simply wait for the tide to turn before you jumped on the ship and went out to the North Sea. So the timing of the tide was crucial for everyday life, and the quality of the water also depended on the time of the tide. So it was tide times which dictated riverside life.
Great, thank you, Gus. It's a fascinating one. I think we tend to lose a little bit of a connection with the tidal character and personality of the river in that central part of the central London stretch of the river. Of course, we get little presences of the foreshore when the tide is lower, but the significance of the tide, the actual reach of the tide, which is quite significant in places along the Thames, and then those particular types of social practices connected with tides and tidal waters is of great interest. And that links me to our conversation also, if we talk about what it is that affects tides and pulls tides and influences tides. It is, of course, the phases of the moon. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about that.
Oh, yes. How many hours have you got? We all know that tides are influenced by the moon. And I'm sure that in the past, long into the past, people must have looked up to the moon and realized that it was exerting power over the river or the sea, or that the sea was dictating to the moon. And I think people thought it was the moon talking to the sea or the river. And every quarter of the moon, the first and third quarter, you have high tides. Now, people must have known it was high tide, and they must have known that the moon was telling them to do that. So I think your idea of the man in the moon, the god in the moon, who was telling the tides what to do and therefore dictating what life on Earth or life on the riverside would be, that is a god to be reckoned with. Apart from the fact that water, fresh water, is life-giving, there you have the moon telling people when to drink fresh water, telling people when to keep clear, the tide is going to be very high, or when it's going to be very low. When you do your journeys, ask the moon. The moon will tell you. It's an extraordinarily celestial engagement.
Thank you, Gus. Yes, the moon talking to the river and the river talking to the moon. Wonderful insight there. And it makes me think about Matt Edgeworth in his book, The Archaeology of Rivers, refers to rivers as wild artifacts. And in this conversation that we've just had, and in the conversation we had the other day, when we were talking about the moon, I wondered whether the river itself becomes almost like a monument. We often, as archaeologists, we like to talk about and engage with monuments, but these natural places as monuments. Would you say that the Thames is a monument in its own right?
Well, it is. Well, the foreshore of the Thames is the last sort of wilderness in London, and it's extraordinary. In the middle of central London, you have this place that the river is in charge of, not the Greater London Authority, not central government, just the river. It is in charge. We pretend it isn't, but it is, and it lets you go down on the foreshore, and it lets you get off the foreshore very fast when it comes in again. It's in charge, and it is nature telling you what to do, or the moon telling you what to do, and la la.
Yes, thank you. The river's in charge. That's a good point of reflection, and the term reflection there as well. Okay.
Which incidentally, going back to your votive offerings in the Thames, might they relate to where the changing tidal head might be, for example?
Yes, yeah, and there has been some work on the Bronze Age metalwork deposition and clusters of that in relationship to particular flows there too. Thanks, Gus. Father Jim, do you have any questions?
Yes, we do have some. I'm going to steal the first one myself. I teach a course on moral development, and we feature, because he's a Londoner, Thomas More. And in the 1962 film, the river plays a prominent role when he lived in Chelsea, and they'd move in and out of the Thames. And it was clearly not the embankment that exists now. It was, a muddy edge that was, impacted by the tide. And I guess I'm wondering, what is the impact of those, the embankment on the life of the river, besides the flooding that inevitably has happened and the need to build them up? But I'm just curious, Gus, what you might say about what other impact might those embankments have had on the river over time?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The great late Victorian embankments, both the Victoria and the Albert embankment, destroyed the original settlements of fishermen or barge builders or whatever. They've just moved out of the way, and this huge walkway was put in, and these extra bridges were put in, which destroyed the livelihood of ferrymen, just so that Londoners could walk up and down the embankment and enjoy the canalised Thames. Yes, it did. It did change the livelihoods of the little villages like Chelsea, which used to be river-based.
Yeah,
it disappeared, is a polite term.
Do you anticipate an increased threat to World Heritage sites and other sites of archaeological research along the river from more frequent and more intense Atlantic storms and the changing climate?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that the River Thames is eroding river walls. That's the least of the problems. Yes, the answer is yes, indeed, and it's not going to get any better. It's a big question, but the simple answer is we better adapt to a very different future. We can tell you what the river was doing 3,000 years ago. We can tell you what it'll be doing in 50, 100 years' time, and you won't like it. Whether you'll do anything about it is another matter.
Right, right. One of our questioners asked, how might these archaeological and phenomenological approaches to the Thames be communicated to a wider public to inform better understanding of the river's protean nature and false perceptions of its immutability? In other words, how might communities be led to understand that ultimately river makes the landscape and not the developers? Faye, this is something you are able to communicate in those small groups that you teach for us, but how might that better be articulated more broadly?
Yeah, there's some wonderful people working in and around the Thames from a cross-disciplinary perspective. I'm thinking of Rachel Lichtenstein's wonderful book, Estuary, which really engages with the social history of the river. There's the wonderful Estuary Festival, which if you go onto the website, is rich in podcasts and talks and films about the people on the river, about the environment on the river, about how artists engage with the elements, with the environment. Writers, there's some books on walking along the Thames Path and how walking along the side and the course of rivers has much to offer with regards to how we understand the river, but also there's a lot of work around the well-being of walking and well-being of rivers. So if you combine the two together, there's something extraordinary. There's been quite a plethora of books around walking along the courses of particular rivers, and there are some on the Thames there itself. So it inspires a lot of creative thinking. And inspires a lot of wonderful work in terms of literature and artworks as well. There was a fantastic piece of work by the artist Mark Dion, who called the Thames Foreshore project, in which he gathered a lot of archaeologists together to collect items from the foreshore, which he then put in a huge Wunderkammer, which is now part of the Tate Modern collection. Not currently on display, but very much in the collection there itself. I don't know, Gus, were you part of that at all when that took place?
We did that. We did sort of help out a bit in the background.
Yeah.
But talking about collaboration, it's the archaeological, the citizen archaeological team is looking very much to collaborate with environmentalists. We see our work not just as archaeologists, but now as eco-archaeologists, because what we're doing is ecology, is studying ecology or the environment. So it's not just dates and this, that, and the other. It is the adaptations to environmental change. So we are ecologists as much as we're archaeologists. And by combining the two, if you go on your walks, etc., you should integrate those two concerns: the difference in biodiversity, the difference in various environmental issues, not least climate change, and how climate change impacts not just on towns but on bird life, fish life, etc., and water quality. All these things are interrelated, so we think we would now call ourselves eco-archaeologists rather than archaeologists.
Sure. How have technical advances in recent years aided in the research of the River Thames and other waterways?
I'll start, but then I'll pass on to Gus. There's a great exhibition taking place in the Museum of London Docklands at the moment called London Port City, which really gives you an insight into the technology of the river, into the river's ports and wharfs and docks, into the social history of the river, and into the river as technology and facilitating technology there as well. So any of you in London, I highly recommend you go to see that. Gus, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
I didn't actually catch the wording of the question.
Gus, it was just what kind of technological advances in recent years have aided in the research you do on the river?
Yes, there's always lots of technological advances, better concrete walls and all this. But what is, I think, becoming key is what they call natural adaptation, and actually looking at how we can work with nature rather than trying to fight nature, the National Trust was very good at this with their own properties. You know, it's using mangrove swamps, shingle spits, sand dunes constructively or sensibly, or working with natural processes that might keep the Thames out or the rising sea levels at bay, rather than just concrete. And looking at river flows, storm drains, water catchment areas, reservoirs at high tides, and all sorts of things. But looking at nature first, looking at what it's trying to do on a coast. You know, the wonderful thing about mangrove swamps and things is that they trap silt coming in at roughly the same speed that sea level is rising. So if you have a Pacific island with a mangrove swamp, don't cut it down and put a concrete wall there. Let it grow, and that will keep the worst of the storms out. It's the same with sand dunes. Don't put concrete walls in front of them. Make sure you have planted sufficient plants to secure the sand dunes in place. The wind will blow sand into them, and the wind will raise those sand dunes and help the property behind it to be safe. So natural adaptation is
That's true.
key. And it's not always possible, of course. If you live in Norfolk, you'll probably know that it's not a good idea to live there. But where you can use natural processes, this is the new answer. You know, University of Southampton, etc., are advocating natural processes. Work with nature. Don't fight it, because you're not going to win.
Excellent. That's a fitting end to our program. And I just really want to thank both of you for your fascinating discussion, as well as for the important work that you do, both in the efforts of sustaining the river, but also in studying its history, but also in teaching others about it. It's an essential matter for all of us, I think, to the greater value of the river. Next week, we're traveling to the Santiago Global Center, where they will discuss water sustainability in Santiago, Chile. Short explainer videos by lecturer Dr. Robert Narenberg are available on the ThinkND website. And please review and come prepared to discuss those matters next week. Also, please feel free to share these series with your friends. We are accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each meeting can stand alone as well. I want to thank our backroom team and all who've assisted us in this here in London, Omer Idle and Joe Byrne, and Kelsey on the Notre Dame alumni side. And finally, yet again, thanks to Professor Faye Stevens and Gustav Milne for their fine contributions today. Thanks again, and I hope you have a marvelous afternoon and evening, depending on where you are. God bless. Take care.